My name is Howie Kislowitz. I'm an associate professor here at the University of Calgary's Faculty of Law. I teach in the areas of constitutional law and administrative law, and I teach a seminar in multiculturalism and law. And my research interest has mostly been on the law of religious freedom in Canada as one way of addressing Canada's diversity. And that brings me into sort of the world of constitutional law. So I have a couple of projects ongoing. One project looks at the role and impact of intervenor organizations in religious freedom case law in Canada. So in Canada, at all levels of court, it's possible for non-governmental organizations to intervene in the proceedings and make their perspectives known. And together with another professor at the University of Victoria's Faculty of Law, we're looking at the impact of those organizations and what role they play exactly in the process. And the project is called Divine Intervention. And then I have a few other projects ongoing, some looking at Indigenous spirituality and how it's treated under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Constitution more generally. I'm looking also at the rules relating to what's called religious communications privilege. So to what extent can a party in litigation rely on a rule of evidence to exclude from consideration a conversation they may have had with a clergy member or something like that. Spoiler, not a lot, it turns out. And then I'm starting a new project that's going to be looking in a sort of bigger abstract way at the methods of interpretation in Canadian law and how those do and don't parallel methods of interpretation in religious traditions. So I love teaching constitutional law. It's great to engage with first-year students. They are enthused, they have high energy, and they don't know anything yet. And so it's a great opportunity to really have an impact on the way they think about law. And in my classroom, I try to keep the atmosphere light and engaging, and I try to give the students an opportunity to really try ideas on for size and feel free to float arguments that maybe they're not sure if they agree with yet, but they can try them on and see how they work in the legal frameworks that we're discussing. So some of my course looks like traditional lectures, but I always make sure to take a few of the classroom sessions to do what's called a flipped classroom exercise, where the students will watch a screencast or a podcast on their own, which is kind of my mini lecture on the materials that I've asked them to read, and then we spend the entire class section doing a problem set together and then discussing what the small groups have come up with in terms of the legal solutions to those kinds of problems. So I had a number of excellent instructors and professors over my law school career and graduate school as well. One course that really opened my mind up, I think, to the way that the state functions was called the administrative process, and taught by a sort of a legend at McGill Law, a guy called Blaine Baker, who has since retired. And I don't think he had necessarily set out to be an inspirational teacher. He just had a very passionate engagement with the subject. And one thing that always stayed with me was how he talked about the materials as teaching and learning materials, and he spoke of himself as a student of the law rather than just an instructor. It made the conversation a little bit different, to think of the enterprise of being in class as something that we were doing together rather than being instructed in. But I also had some small group seminars that made a big impact on me. So also at McGill, when I was a law student, Professor Shauna Van Prague taught a class called Social Diversity and the Law, and that's been a big influence on the seminar I teach called Multiculturalism and Law, and that I felt really at home in that class. I hadn't read a lot of the materials before, but it really resonated with some of my own experiences and the ways that I was starting to think about law in terms of theories of legal pluralism and addressing questions of diversity. And I had a course on a similar subject matter as a grad student taught by Audrey Macklin at the University of Toronto called Law and the Encultured Subject. So again, looking at questions of law's engagement with minority communities who identify themselves by the culture to which they belong. So those two courses really shaped my seminar course. I drew a lot of the materials from there, which I love teaching. I actually find preparing for a seminar course a lot more nerve-wracking than preparing for a lecture course, because when I'm lecturing, I basically know how long things will take. I kind of take the reins of the class. I encourage student engagement, but mostly I'm in control of what's being said in class, whereas seminar courses, the idea of a seminar course is that the students really lead the discussion, and I'm there as kind of a guide or a navigator through some of the materials. And I find those moments the most stressful, that the idea that maybe nobody's going to say anything today. But I've found it really rewarding, because I end up over preparing for those courses. I prepare, a page full of questions, and I end up getting through 2 or 3 because students have been very engaged in the materials typically, and they bring perspectives that I never could have had on my own. So they either through their own life experiences, whether they're members of racialized communities or other kinds of minority communities, talking about challenges that they've experienced with the law, or that they've seen a misfit about the way the law is talked about in the cases and the way that their lives have gone on. So that's been a real learning opportunity for me, and I love those moments. But also just in terms of bringing fresh ideas. So they may have a training that's very different from my own. I took political science and law, which is a pretty typical route, I think, but some students studied philosophy, or maybe they studied engineering, or maybe they studied biology or music or what have you. Each of those kinds of backgrounds, I think, plays into the way that they see the materials that we put in front of them. And I live for those moments when I can get that fresh perspective.